Elon Musk is far from the first wealthy person to fall for the poverty trap. A century ago, the gentlemen on the left both achieved fabulous fortunes, only to die broke a couple decades later. But save your pity not for the tycoons of the world, but for everyday people in their homes, villages, cities, and nations who are also falling for the trap today. This channel focuses on cities, so our question is, how can cities avoid the poverty trap that has broken so many people in the past, and no doubt so many in the future? Today, as a permaculture urbanist, I'll walk you through how the trap works, its triggers, how not one but 3 kinds of social capital can help. Then I'll provide 4 real-world examples from 4 U.S. steel towns which had 2 wildly different economic outcomes. And of course, we'll conclude with what cities can do to avoid the trap and start a virtuous wealth cycle. Welcome to Edenicity, best practices for sustainably abundant cities. You know that you're starting to fall into the poverty trap when you begin to hear phrases such as zero-sum, winner-take-all, sink or swim, every man for himself. Maybe people start calling each other loser. They start asking in various ways, what's in it for me? They begin trying to pad their world with loyalists. And in tech circles where I've worked for many years, you'll hear phrases like evolution in action or survival of the fittest. And at the very end of this episode, I'll show how that last phrase is probably the biggest misquote of all time. These phrases are just the beginning of the poverty cycle, because this winner-take-all attitude starts to create a low-trust society, which leads to less cooperation, less economic exchange and innovation, and that by itself begins to lead to poverty. When you have a winner-take-all environment and definite losers, people on the bottom are envious of those at the top, people on the top are afraid of being deposed by those on the bottom, and it gets to be a very dog-eat-dog world. Now, although this can happen spontaneously, more often it happens as a result of stressors. For example, adverse events such as pandemics. I know COVID rocked everybody's world, as well as storms, fires, heat waves, and other disasters. These sometimes provide opportunities for adverse relationships. This is when oligarchs appear with the attitude, hey, if somebody's got to win, it might as well be me. And with an anything-goes attitude, launch into a career of corruption, benefiting from inequality, hiring demagogues and spreading disinformation, basically getting as many people as they can to blame the most powerless among them for all their troubles, rather than the oligarchs themselves. This is a classic pattern that has been known since antiquity. But not all stressors are personal. We can also face adverse infrastructure that is so pervasive in our lives that we become almost numb to its many insidious effects. For example, car traffic stigmatizes cities with their constant pollution, noise, danger, the vast swaths of ugly pavement they need, and the many diseases of inactivity that come from driving them. Cars are even responsible for a lot of the feeling of crowding that we have in cities. The pedestrians in the picture below, for example, are cooped up on the sidewalk waiting for a walk signal so that they can cross the vast streets occupied by a sea of cars. And finally, of course, we can be stressed into having very low trust for those around us by adverse policy. In the US, for example, we have shootings just in the last couple of years in bars, bowling alleys, churches, colleges, concerts, festivals, highways, homes, hospitals, parades, parks, parking lots, parties, playgrounds, public meetings, restaurants, schools, stores, theaters, trains, and vigils. The point is, our modern world does not lack for stressors that can launch us into the low trust that is necessary to begin the poverty cycle. So what can we do about it? Well, if the poverty cycle is a problem of lack, then the solution is to bring in new sources of wealth. And one powerful source that we have is social capital. It turns out that there are at least 3 kinds of social capital. The first is probably the one most of us are most familiar with. This is bonding social capital, which occurs between members of a tight in-group. Think of the corner pub or the fans of a sports team or a poor neighborhood where everybody looks after their own. Bonding social capital is all about in-group loyalty, and it is a very powerful tool for survival and continuity. It was bonding social capital that saved so many lives during the heat wave in Chicago that I spoke about in an earlier episode. Unfortunately, because the bonds can be so tight within an in-group, there can be gaps between groups where people just don't quite fit. And this is an area where the second kind of social capital, bridging social capital, comes into play. This is the capital that bridges different groups or subgroups or even isolated individuals who have only loose ties with any groups. You'll see bridging social capital at work in conferences, concerts, and other events that happen relatively infrequently, say once a month or less. Unlike bonding social capital, this is the domain of weak ties to a much larger group of people. And this is the domain of higher incomes. Why? Because exposure to a wide diversity not only of people but of subcultures, groups, and subgroups exposes you to far more opportunity and far more innovation. Job hunters networking at a conference are engaging in bridging social capital. Surely there must be some value in linking these economic classes, and that is our third kind of social capital. This is the domain of philanthropy and public investment. Now, the essential point, if you get nothing else from today's video, is that cities need all three kinds of social capital if they want to escape the poverty trap. Let's get into those real-world examples. Allentown, Pennsylvania, and Youngstown, Ohio were both steel towns that were booming in the 1950s. But by 2020, they had taken wildly different economic and social trajectories. While Allentown grew by more than 20%, Youngstown shrank by more than half. Worse, by 2020, while the median income in Allentown was a respectable $53,000 per household, in Youngstown it was a miserable $35,000. Two cities that started out in about the same place but ended up in two very different situations. What happened? Well, in the 1950s, consultants warned both towns that the steel industry was on its way out, and that they'd better diversify their economies. Allentown was pretty successful at it. They had a diverse social network, many businesses that didn't interact too much together, but were advisors to local nonprofits such as the Boy Scouts. Had very strong bridging social capital. They already had quite a bit of diversity, so it was natural for them to think in terms of bringing in outside resources and energy, and to build the linking capital that it would take to link the various economic classes in a way that was harmonious. So by the 1970s, they were building industrial parks and successfully attracting new industries such as specialty electronics and chemicals. They invested in expanding their transportation networks. They convinced Penn State to open a campus in town, and built a diverse set of industrial and civic partnerships with the university. And Allentown launched its own private equity fund to invest in startups that were generated from the university and its many partnerships. By comparison, Youngstown's social network was basically ingrown. As is the case with oligarchs everywhere, the relatively few companies in town had interlocking directorates. It was not unusual for a banker, for example, to sit on the boards of 16 companies, and for the CEOs of a bunch of those companies to sit on the board of the bank. Even in the civic sphere, there were relatively few organizations, and these were headed up by the wives of the businessmen who had interlocking directorates. In short, Youngstown had very strong bonding capital, which led to a great deal of in-group loyalty, but carried with it a suspicion and aversion to working with outsiders. And it was catastrophic for Youngstown. But wait, there's more. Birmingham, Alabama, and Atlanta, Georgia were also a pair of booming steel towns. In both cases, they began at railroad crossings and developed thriving steel industries, and had nearly identical populations by 1950. But as early as 1940, they were already on wildly different tracks. That was the year that Delta Airlines, which flew between the two cities, wanted to start a larger-scale aviation hub in at least one of the cities. Birmingham, which had a very insular, oligarchic social structure, responded by hiking the aviation fuel tax. Meanwhile, Atlanta responded by saying, "Hey, this is great. We'll even build you some new terminals." The Birmingham oligarchs were suspicious of outsiders and especially fearful of the union influences that the airlines might bring to town, as well as foreigners, especially Mexicans, who they were genuinely afraid of. In 1961, Birmingham was the infamous site of the Ku Klux Klan attacks on civil rights marchers, followed by police who turned the fire hoses and sicked their police dogs on the protesters as well. When asked for comment, the Atlanta mayor said Atlanta was too busy to hate. That alone is a strong piece of cultural evidence that Atlanta had very strong bridging capital, while Birmingham, which only really had bonding capital, was stuck in the poverty trap. Atlanta vastly expanded the public transit available in town and worked with the airlines to make the airport an international flight hub. As a result, by 2020, Atlanta had grown by nearly 60%. While Birmingham, tragically, had shrunk by a third. And today, the median household income in Atlanta is almost twice as much as in Birmingham. Let that sink in. I know a lot of what I talk about sounds very theoretical, but it's grounded in these harsh realities. The poverty trap is very real. Now, what about linking capital? The capital that connects the different economic classes. Well, just last year, Birmingham, Alabama had 2 million rides on its public transit, while Atlanta had 65 million rides on public transit. Again, just enormous attention to linking social capital. And those airport expansions, well, Birmingham had 3 million passengers last year, while Atlanta, with 108 million passengers, was the world's busiest airport. For cities that understand the nuances of social capital and act on them with policy and initiatives, the rewards are great, and they enter into the wealth cycle, which is a win-win mentality where there's ever more trust, more cooperation, more wealth, more public amenities, and more people feeling like they're not only not being left behind, but that they're living in a place where they can have a brighter future. Now, I know if you're familiar with Allentown or Atlanta, I'm sure you can come up with many reasons that these are far from ideal cities, and I'm sure you're right. But the point is that they are far better off for having attended to the 3 nuances of social capital and really developed them. All right, this is a design show, so let's distill this down into a prescription. How can cities avoid the poverty trap? Now, understand that at all levels of a city, you need all 3 kinds of social capital, but there's a slightly different emphasis at different scales. Neighborhoods are the natural size for bonding social capital to shine. And the ways to develop more bonding social capital that keeps people safe in emergencies and creates stability and good vibes is to make the neighborhoods walkable and mixed use so that there's lots of cafes or shops nearby, and there get to be regulars in different venues. You have quality mixed income housing, and you build common areas, common amenities, playgrounds, natural and edible landscaping, as I've discussed in many other episodes. This holds all the way from the scale of a few blocks to a neighborhood of up to maybe 6,000 people or so. The next level up in scale would be with what I call a town, which could be anywhere from 100 to maybe 200,000 people, or a region composed of several towns. This is the right scale to focus on bridging social capital, again through a well-developed commons such as public transit, parks, libraries, lots of shared amenities, as well as activities such as festivals and a whole bunch of other things that I listed in this video here. And finally, at the scale of a really large city composed of many towns or several regions, you're now at the scale where linking social capital comes into its own. And now you want to form large-scale partnerships. These could be in education, industry, media, intercity high-speed rail, and large-scale wild habitat restoration. At this scale, you have the expertise and level of coordination and raw labor available to make some dramatic improvements. Now, as I was making this list, I noticed something, and I've highlighted it in yellow. Commons, activities, and partnerships are actually the framework that I used in the Greener Village Blueprint for people who want to move their neighborhood in a dramatically more sustainable direction. And I've put a link to that free document in the description below. I've also given a few more real-world examples of some of these practical tips in my book, Housing in 4 Cities, also available in the download in the description below. Okay, I know you've been waiting for that factoid, so here it is. When Charles Darwin added that comment about survival of the fittest to the 5th edition of his The Origin of Species, he was not talking about fittest as in strongest or fastest, but instead fittest as in the species that fit best with the mix of other species around them. In other words, survival of the fittest was about bridging natural capital. If you're curious about the Edenisty land use concept, you can download it from the description below. And I know it's really rectangular, and just for conceptual clarity, real landscapes are curvy, and any real implementation of Edenicity would be curvy too. If you want to see some more examples about how to build social capital in a city, have a look at this video here. And thanks as always to the wonderful patrons for supporting this work. I really appreciate it. Take care, stay green, see you next time.